them for their main troops. You know, so they had some of them, but the main Turkish troops refused to fight with them. And so the Mongols were so vicious that then they started migrating west. They had to leave. So they started migrating west, and then the Seljuks then, came into, as we saw, the area where the Persian area, and they started intermarrying with the people there, and they took on a lot of Persian culture. So they're a mixture, of that. And so they were the rulers. So the Abbasid was so weak that they took on the Seljuks as their wazir, their minister, like a prime minister. Like we say in the example of the Queen of England and then the prime minister. So the prime ministers really got the power, more of the power. So Nizam al-Mulk took on that, and he was, in a sense, ruling. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa usalli wa usallam ala Sayyid al-Awwaleen wal Akhirin Nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barak wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, as we continue on in our understanding of revivalism, we're looking at tajdeed, the renewal, the revival of the deen. And we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, has given us a living message that continues to grow and continues to gain new life. In the same way that plants die in the winter or appear to die, something remains of a seed, and then when the proper conditions come, the spring comes, then it rises back. So similarly with the Muslim world, there is that seed of the Quran which is preserved by the mercy of Allah, and the authentic teachings of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is preserved by the mercy of Allah. So that is like a seed that can go through changes, maybe covered over a little bit. With right conditions, it comes back up. So the conditions of tajdeed needs an individual, mujaddid, or a group. And as Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi had said, that person or that group needs to take the best of al-qadim, al-nafi', the beneficial past knowledge, and al-jadid al-salih. And it is the new beneficial. It is the new righteous or good. What is good from the new time period, right? What is suitable and is modern or new, combined with the beneficial past. So you're not losing the past and you're not losing the present. The past comes back alive in the present. Okay, but you're not losing the plant that comes out of the seed. So this really is the essence. And as we understood when we went back into Islamic history, we understood that going back in time to the period of the 11th century, of the Common Era, of the Christian era, during that time, we find that the Abbasid Khalifa, the Khilafat, the leadership of the Abbasids had become very weak. And to a certain extent, it was a symbolic type of leadership. And it was the Seljuk Turks who came out of Central Asia and combined and intermarried with people in the Persian area and developed a type of Turkish-Persian culture, taking the best of both, that they succeeded in being the force which helped to solidify the Abbasid Khilafat and also strengthen the Muslim world and to unite the forces behind the leadership of Islam. So it is through the Seljuk group and Nizam al-Mulk, who was one of the leaders from the Seljuk, who was associated with the Abbasids, and they recognized his abilities. And he became the leading wazir, almost like the prime minister of the Islamic Empire. So literally the Seljuks were in a dominating role, and one of the great moves that Nizam al-Mulk made was to develop not only hospitals and business and to develop people and to unite people, but he also developed institutions of learning. And these institutions of learning were especially to bring back that spirit of Islam and to protect the Quran and the Sunnah. Because by that time there were a number of different deviant groups that had come into the Muslim world. And because of the corruption that came on the upper class, there was a need to develop strong leadership and guidance. And so it was to the credit of Nizam al-Mulk that they developed these Nizamiya institutions Okay, Madrasa Nizamiya, we will call it Nizamiya College. And of course, Nizam is Nidam in Arabic. But that's how it's pronounced, in the Persian. The Nizamiya College system. And it is in that system that Imam Al-Ghazali, born in the city of Tus, and that is the same place that Nizam al-Mulk was born, that he was put into that institution, by his guardians, his parents and guardians, and he entered into the Nizamiya College at 20 years old, and he began to study Islamic theology and fiqh and whatnot. And fortunately for him, at that time, Nizam al-Mulk was spending the wealth of the Abbasids, and they were one of the richest empires on earth at that time. Baghdad was, a huge city, and the extent of the Muslim world. So they had a lot of excess wealth to spend. And they put it into the institution, and they offered positions, we call tenureships, to professors at universities today. So they offered these platforms and these areas of control for great scholars. And one of the great scholars of the Muslim world was Imam al-Haramain Abul Ma'ali Abdul Malik al-Juwayni. And al-Juwayni, rahimahullah, was an amazing scholar at the time. And Imam Al-Ghazali came underneath him and became his leading student. And what was amazing about Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, is that right from the beginning he began to shine. And he started to master logic and rhetoric, the ability to debate and discuss things, literary style. He started writing books. And as a young student, Al-Juwayni was saying, this young man has got an ocean of knowledge, to the point where he actually made him his assistant principal or rector of the Nizamiya institution, which is not a small thing. This is a big thing. At the same time, Imam Al-Ghazali attended the Zawiyah. This is the area of the people of Tasawwuf, and we'll be discussing that further, the people who focused on ihsan and spirituality. He also studied under the scholars and the mystics, there in the Zawiyah. So he was getting all types of input in his knowledge. And it was in 1085, as we have learned, Al-Juwayni passed away. And so this was a very critical point in the life of Imam Al-Ghazali, because Nizam al-Mulk, recognizing the reputation of Imam Al-Ghazali, asked him to be not only a professor, but to be the leading professor in the Nizamiya institution of Baghdad. And that was the top Nizamiya institute in the whole of the Muslim world at the time. And this would be like today in America, Harvard University, MIT in the UK, Oxford in France, Sorbonne in Canada, University of Toronto, McGill in some areas. This would be the top institution, in the country. And this really would be, you could say, for most of the Muslim world. And they were recognized, by scholars and institutions throughout the Muslim world, that this was the pinnacle of knowledge. Because remember now, it was in the Khilafat of Ali ibn Abi Talib, radiallahu anh, of the Khulafa al-Rashidin. He moved the Khilafat from Medina to Kufa, which is Iraq. So he moved the capital of Islam to Iraq. So it was in Kufa and Basra, these two famous cities, that many of the great scholars of the Muslim world went to get their knowledge. So this, you could say, was the heartland of Islamic knowledge. And so if somebody wanted to have the highest level understanding, they would go there for some of their studies, and then they would specialize in the different areas of the Muslim world that they live in. So this was an amazing time for Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah. And, But as he started to master this knowledge, and he was taking in everything, he had a photogenic memory. He would read passages and commit it to memory. Allah blessed him, with this ability and the ability to bring it back. Again, and not only that, the ability to delve deep into the knowledge. So he didn't just memorize like a parrot. He actually went deep into it. And he could understand all of the depth of this knowledge. And it was, at that point that he had taken in so much knowledge that he started to doubt things. Because he had, and people say, well, how is this? I mean, even they say, when you look at the Webster, if you look at the, encyclopedias, early encyclopedias in America in these places in the early 20th century, they only had like 3 volumes, right? So the knowledge, book knowledge in a sense, today we have an explosion of knowledge. Because with the computers, we can take all this knowledge from everywhere and bring it together. It wasn't like that before. So before, if you were a really powerful student and you could memorize and take it in, you could literally master knowledge in your area. So in the area of the Islamic studies, he was literally, mastering the different, levels of Islamic knowledge. And so, but some doubt started to come in because the level that he reached. So he had to sort of step back for a little bit and take sort of a leave, still, being the, principal, the rector, but take a little bit of leave. And then he started going deep into knowledge. He wanted to take it to the furthest possible end. That's the type of person he was. This really is important in our concept of a mujaddid. Because the mujaddid, as we learn, has got to have an expansive knowledge of Islam. So they've got to have this broad knowledge of Islam, and they have to be aware of what is happening in the time that they're living. So what he did was, he basically broke down the types of knowledge and the people who were bringing this knowledge into 4 parts. Okay, so these are the areas that he went into. And one is the scholastic theology, al-mutakallimun, and this would be your regular Islamic studies, like your aqidah, your Quranic studies, tafsir, hadith, whatnot. These are the ones who graduate from institutes like this. Okay, and these are the scholastic, alim, the ulama, like this. Then, another form is the philosophers. And the philosophers were people who believed in rational thinking. That in order to understand something, you got to use reasoning for it. Even scientists can be considered like that today. Because the scientist wants the facts of science. Otherwise, they don't want to hear it. Okay, so it's that type of thing, thinking. There's the Greek philosophers, and also the scientists of the day. The third area is the area of the Ta'limites, or the Batiniya. And this is esoteric knowledge. This is secret knowledge. So the groups that believed that there was secretive knowledge that was not known to the public. See, the people in the scholastic knowledge, they can say, when you bring a subject, they say, where's your dalil? Where's your proof? So you've got to bring a hadith, you've got to bring an ayah, you've got to bring a saying of the scholar. It's all there in the books. But the Batiniya people are the ones who claim that there's a type of internal knowledge. And this internal knowledge is not known to the general public. So that's another area of knowledge. And the third was tasawwuf, and that is ihsan, the spirituality. And these are the people who believed, that this ihsan was not just book knowledge, it was experiential knowledge as well. And so in these areas, we'll look a little bit at what he did, his achievements in these areas. Again, I'm giving you a summary of a lot of his life and a long period of time. The first area of the scholastic knowledge. So these theologians, they believed in wahi, revelation. Okay, so basically you have your Quran, you have your Hadith, and you use your reasoning to a certain extent, but the your basic knowledge comes from the Quran and the Sunnah. It's your superficial proofs, right? It's those proofs. And he went deep into this. And of course, remember, he's studying under Al-Juwayni, and his ability to now read everybody's books and memorize so many different things that he started to master this, especially in the area of fiqh. And in your fiqh, your jurisprudence, fiqh means fahm, it means your understanding. It is literally your understanding, of Islam. And here he found that the people who were specializing in this area, they became frozen. They became dry imitators. In other words, it's a thing which is called taqleed, and that is where you just regurgitate. So you will hear some information, and you just regurgitate the information. You don't even think about what it is that you're saying, but you just regurgitate that information, and they lost the spirit of ijtihad. And ijtihad is the ability to deal with new issues. So you tackle a new issue, and you bring decisions based upon your sources and based upon the environment, and what is going on. And as time goes on, we have to have ijtihad, because there's new things that are coming along. Look at so many things happening now. It's an explosion for us. Because all the computer science, the medical things that are going on, how do you deal with birth control, abortions? How do you deal with fetus? Putting in organs. All these things that the early generation never dealt with. You got to have ijtihad. So somebody has got to have the knowledge of the past and be able to reason Islamically and come up with a new solution, a fatwa. Okay, so they had lost this. And that's where their weakness was. And to a certain extent, they became like the Christian monks. Because what happened in Europe is they had their Bible and they had their teachings, and they became so frozen that when people came with scientific information now, they actually attacked the scientists, and they would burn them at the stake, and they refused to listen to any science. So Europe became frozen because it's only these spiritual teachings, and it's refusing to accept the new modern inventions and the new modern knowledge. So to a certain extent, they became frozen like this. So is there a sound coming out of the back? Yeah, there's a feedback which is heard here. So some of the students are hearing it back, so if you can adjust that feedback sound a little bit. And so Imam Al-Ghazali, in his early time and then later, he writes Al-Mustasfa, which is Usul al-Fiqh. So that is your foundations of fiqh. Right, so really what he's doing is, he is literally, giving away, he's showing how to make ijtihad, how to make decisions, how to use your Islamic knowledge today. That's what he's doing. And that's tajdeed, right? That's literally the revival of Islam. So, and then he also looks at Sharia, and he provides a rational explanation for Sharia. So some people will say, okay, what's the benefit of fasting? Why are you starving yourself? So he can give you some physical, reasoning why fasting actually helps your body, and it clears your mind, as well as your spiritual teachings, right? So he's got this ability to do this, right? So that's what he did. He went into that area and he exhausted, and he found that the theologians in the Muslim world, they had become blind imitators. Okay, and they were upset with him to a certain extent because he was exposing them, right? And you'll find this in some of our institutions today, if we look at our own self, where people get into their school of thought, and it's only Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki. And if you come to them with other information, they look at you like you're crazy. Okay? And even simple things, like, wala darleen in salat, and you say Ameen out loud, they look at you like you've done something wrong. Whereas it is permissible to do that. And if they had a broad knowledge of Islam and the Sunnah, they would say, okay, that's permissible. You don't have to do it, but it's permissible. They became frozen, right? Blind imitators. And so Imam Al-Ghazali then started to provide, a way to explain to people about Islam. And this is because the Muslim world had become, it was under attack by philosophers. Now remember, Islam is spreading rapidly. 100 years, it reached China, on one side far north into Russia, deep into the Swahili coast of Africa, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And when they went to these different parts of the world, they ran across different cultures. They ran across Jewish scholars, Christian scholars, Buddhists, Hindu, traditional religion. And so the people who were embracing Islam in the different countries, they had scholarship. In the Persian Empire, they had scholars for thousands of years. Okay, Buddhist, teachings go back thousands of years. So they had philosophies, they had writings, they had their own books. And the Greeks, and the Romans, the Greeks had inherited a lot of their knowledge from the ancient Egyptians. And the Greeks were, became very strong in theoretical knowledge and also philosophy, reasoning things out. So they want to reason things out. Why is this? They questioned a lot of things, and they presented philosophical reasonings for everything. And that's how a lot of scientists think today. Okay? So Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, he went into the Greek writings. So many of their writings were translated into Arabic. So he went into the Greek writings, and also Ibn Sina, his writings, and Al-Farabi, and there are great Islamic philosophers. Al-Ash'ari, who was originally in a philosophical group, because there was a group of people who really took in the philosophy, and they started philosophizing in Islam. Mu'tazila, they were called Al-Mu'tazila. And they actually started philosophizing into Islam and coming up with some strange ideas. So Ash'ari, his father was of the Mu'tazila, and he took in their information, he rebelled against them, and he started struggling against them. So the Ash'ari writings, are a lot of it is answering the Mu'tazila and these philosophies. Imam Al-Ghazali took it a step further, because Ash'ari had taken a lot of that stuff in, and he did not have the background that Imam Al-Ghazali had. Remember, Imam Al-Ghazali starts off as a major scholar. That's how he starts. So when he goes into philosophy, he already has a base. Right? Al-Ash'ari starts off as a Mu'tazila. He starts off in that philosophical background. He's gaining knowledge as well, but not the level of Imam Al-Ghazali. So this is why, he's so great in this area. And he writes books. He writes Maqasid al-Falsafa. And this is the intentions of the philosophers. And then Tahafud al-Falsafa, where he's writing the refutation of the philosophers. He's refuting their arguments. Okay? So they're coming with these dry, type of philosophical arguments. And they're trying to explain, things. And, reason everything out. And he he starts to refute their arguments. And he did such a beautiful job of refuting these people that he actually stopped the advance of Greek philosophy. When he refuted them, and remember, he's in Nizamiya, right? So that's the pinnacle of knowledge. He refutes them. He writes a book. He's answering their questions. He shuts them down. The same way today, you remember when the Christians were coming into the Muslim world in the 60s and coming right into our houses and everything, and then Sheikh Ahmed Deedat came in South Africa. He had grown up, in a seminary. He studied in a Christian seminary, although he had a Muslim background. So he took a stand against the Christian missionaries, and he shut them down for a period of time. He stood in front of them, and he took their proofs, and he answered them back. And they never faced that before from Muslims in recent times. So Imam Al-Ghazali takes the philosophical ideas, right? And he shuts down the philosophers. So this is a major achievement. And actually, you could say for a few hundred years, he stopped them from doing anything hurting the Muslim world. And, his influence is so great that it actually spread to Europe. Because in Europe was the same problem with philosophy in terms of religion. The monks were not able to explain belief in God and the hereafter and spirituality in terms of this reasoning. And so his teachings shows you how to bring belief in God and spirituality and explain it in a rational way. So St. Thomas Aquinas, they call St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the great Christian theologians. He actually read Imam Al-Ghazali's works, and he was influenced, and he even says that. He was influenced. Al-Ghazal, they called him Al-Ghazal, because they got to Christianize the name. So they call him Al-Ghazal. Ibn Sina, Avicenna. Ibn Rushd, right, Avicenna, right? Ibn Rushd, Averroes, right? So Al-Ghazal. So he said, I've been reading the work of Al-Ghazal, right? People don't know it's Imam Al-Ghazali, right, that he's reading, right? Musa, Ibn Ma'mun, who's known as Maimonides, one of the greatest Jewish scholars in their history, was influenced by Imam Al-Ghazali's teachings. Maimonides, who was a great Jewish scholar who lived in Andalusia, and he served in the court of the Egyptian leaders and many people. They say it was the height of Jewish philosophy and scholarship there in Spain, in Andalusia. He was influenced by Imam Al-Ghazali as well. Okay? So this was major work that he did in the area of philosophy. And he's got his books and proofs for the people who are coming up. The next area is the area of the Ta'limites, the esoteric area, the Batiniya. Now, this is the secretive groups. There are groups who came, now remember now, with Kufa being the center of Islam, Kufa and Iraq was also the center of magic. And the Quran speaks about that magic was first introduced to Babylon. That two angels, Harut and Marut, they brought magic as a test on people. This is occult knowledge. It's the knowledge of the jinn. It's secretive knowledge. So Kufa, especially, was packed with people like this. Underground, secretive groups. Okay? Islam comes and then takes over. There's a political struggle going on. So amongst especially the family of the Prophet ﷺ, who were under attack by the Umayyads, these and then the remnants of the ancient of the Sassanid dynasty, Persian dynasty, they formed these underground cult movements because they wanted power again. They did not want the Khalifa. They wanted power. So literally, these Batiniya groups, and as we had explained before, one of the leading Batiniya groups was the Ismailis. So the Ismailis, you have the Ithna Ashari Shia, who are the Twelvers. They believe in 12 Imams. And their center was Iraq. Then you have the Seveners, who believe in 7 Imams. Because with Jafar as-Sadiq, coming in and they're the leaders of the Ahlul Bayt, who were regular scholars, somebody had to take over, the family of the Prophet ﷺ, keep them protected, and be the leading scholar from the family. And so when it came to the seventh Imam, Ismail was the oldest son. But because some people say he had bad habits, he didn't meet their standard, they rejected him. But people loved him because he's the oldest son. So they formed the Ismaili group, which they call Seveners, Sab'iyya. And they believe that Imamate stops at 7. And 7 is a mystical number for many societies. So they say Imamate stops at 7, not 12. Okay? And they believe that Ismail and the Imams, who are descendants of Ali and Fatima, they are given secretive knowledge. So what they believe is that Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anh, and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh, they were given secret knowledge. This is not the regular knowledge given to the Sahaba. And so people believed that, Ali passed it on to people. He passed it on. And so the knowledge that Ali and Abu Bakr passed on, they believe was given in a chain. They call silsila. So it's a chain of secret knowledge. It's a silsila. And they believe that when you join this group, which becomes like we call today a cult, when you join it, then you are given secret knowledge. And this is where, when the Crusaders came into the Muslim world, especially the Knights Templar, many of the Knights Templar, because at that time their culture was very low, and they were seeking knowledge and culture, so they became Arabicized, and they took on this knowledge. And many of the Templars, they studied under the Batiniya movements. And many people believe that this was the basis of the Knights Templar, which is the basis of the Freemasonic movement today. And if you study the Masonic movement, you will see it dates back to the Templars. The Templars brought this knowledge back. And so these underground Batiniya groups who had the levels of knowledge, because the Masons have certain levels. You get degrees. When you join the Masons, they teach you different signs and knowledge, and you pledge not to give it to anybody. And then if you are worthy, they give you another degree, until you reach like the highest level, right, within their order. This is how the Masonic, movement worked. This was already being done by the Ismailis. That's where they got it from. But the problem with these groups is that their knowledge is secret knowledge. So how can you actually tell whether what he's saying to you is true or not? That's the problem. Okay? But because they had influence, they had their groups, they had their businesses, they took over North Africa, and eventually they based themselves in Egypt. They were called the Fatimids. The Fatimids of Egypt. They built Cairo's masjids. Azhar University was built by the Fatimids. Okay, some of the biggest masjids in Cairo was built by the Fatimids. Okay, so their leaders were ruling, and they believed that their leaders were descendants from Ismail, and they had divine knowledge. One of their leaders, Al-Hakim bi Amrillah, and this is around the 11th century. They believed that Allah was in him, literally in this man. So he was like a divine being. And you have another person, Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Darzi, who breaks away from him, goes to the Shuf Mountains in Lebanon, has his own revelation, and he forms another group called Duruz. Have you ever heard of the Duruz? Duruz people are in the Middle East. Some of them are in Lebanon, some of them are Israelis too. They're in the military. Many of the Israeli soldiers who speak Arabic are Duruz. And they're in Syria and they're in Lebanon. Okay? And if you look at them, they wear Islamic clothes, but they believe that they have a revelation. Only men can read it. Women can't read it. And they believe that their revelation is the final one, and if you're not reading their book, you're going to hell. And they're a secret group, underground, called Duruz. So there are a number of these Batiniya groups that were forming. As we learned before, one of the groups was formed by Hassan al-Sabah, who had studied, with Nizam al-Mulk. So the same area of Tus, and that area there, the early Nizamiya, or even before that, he studied with Nizam al-Mulk, but he refused to go along with the Sunnah, and he got into the Shia thing heavy. And he formed his own sect, a cult. And he went into the mountains in Syria, Alamut Mountains, and he trained his people in these secretive arts, where you have degrees that you go to. And he promised them levels of paradise. He promised them the virgins of paradise and everything if you follow me. And, in this life, you will also have women. He brought women there. And then, you're going to be like on earth, you're going to smoke hashish. So you're high in this life and high in the next life. Right? So these people, they also train martial arts. And they train the secretive arts of the ninja-like warriors. And they became hashashin, or assassins. And as we learn, this is where the word assassin actually comes from. Okay, so this was another Batiniya group. That's Hassan al-Sabah, the assassins. Another of the groups is called Qaramita. The Qaramita lived in eastern Arabia, Al-Hassa, which is called Hassa now, eastern side of Arabia, because there's a lot of Shia actually in eastern Arabia. Because remember, it's close to Iraq, right? And the basis of the Shia is Iraq. That's where Ali is buried. That's where Karbala is. And right next to them is Arabia. So the Hassa region there was the base of the Qaramita. And they became an extreme group. And extreme understandings. Where they even started to cut down the amount of salats. And, make certain things halal, that is haram. And they got so powerful that they went to Mecca. And they took over Mecca, and they stole the black stone. A lot of people don't know this, right? They stole the black stone from Mecca, and they took it to the eastern part of Arabia. And they kept it there for almost 20 years. So if you made Hajj during that time, and you come to kiss the black stone, there's nothing in there, right? The Qaramita got it. And they're doing their own Batiniya stuff in eastern Arabia. The Abbasids then got their armies and everything, went there, conquered them, got the black stone back, and then put it back into the Kaaba. Okay? So these Qaramita, that's a serious group here. Very serious. Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, he tackled the Batiniya groups. And he went into their teachings as a master of Islamic sciences, a master of rational thinking. He went into their thing and he proved that their positions is not an Islamic position, because they believed that their leaders, the Imams, were what they call ma'soom, infallible. They believed that all the creation submits to their Imams. And he proved that even Prophet Muhammad ﷺ did not claim that. He was infallible in terms of the revelation coming to him. But as a human being, he made mistakes. And there's points in his life where his companions even corrected him when he made mistakes. He allowed them to do that. But they didn't believe that. They believed their leaders were almost like demigods. So Imam Al-Ghazali refuted them. Right? And he wrote Kitab al-Mustazhiri because the Abbasid Khalifa asked him to do a text. So this Kitab al-Mustazhiri is the refutation of the Batiniya. Right? And because of this, they hated him. They hated Imam Ghazali. And they plotted against Nizam al-Mulk. And they eventually succeeded in assassinating Nizam al-Mulk. And that's not easy, because this is the Seljuk. Okay, who has his guards, but these people would sit on the road like a beggar, and they sit there after Jummah, and they look really beat up, and they can't do anything. And then when the Khalifa's retinue is coming out of the masjid, then they would work their way in the crowd and say, "Oh, give me some," and then dive in the air and stab him with a poison knife. And once they hit you once with that knife, you're gone. This poison. And then they even killed themselves. Because they were insane, right? And they succeeded in killing Nizam al-Mulk. And they also killed other leaders as well. And some people say that, when Imam Al-Ghazali left Baghdad, you'll see this in his career, that may be part of the reason why he left. Because there was what we call a contract on him. There was a hit on him, right? That you call today, right? So people were actually ready to take him out. And he was not Nizam al-Mulk that had Seljuk bodyguards. He was a scholar. Okay? So this is the third group. The fourth group that he went into in details is the people of Tasawwuf. And we know that in Bab al-Ihsan, that in the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, according to some of the great Sufi scholars, that Tasawwuf was a reality with no name. So the concept of zuhud, abstinence, not living of this world. The Prophet ﷺ had natural zuhud. He didn't starve himself and go on a mountain and put on clothes and stand on his head for 2 days. He didn't do that, but his lifestyle was that his bed was very harsh, till it makes marks on his back. He eats very simple food, only eats meat maybe once or twice a month or something like that. He has very little material goods. Zuhud was natural thing. When gold came into Medina and silver, the Prophet ﷺ would give all of the gold away and then he'd go to sleep. So he did not want to be involved in the dunya, and he said that inna likulli umma fitna wa fitnatu ummati al-mal. Every nation has a trial and test. Trial and test of this nation is money. It's wealth. Okay? So the people of Tasawwuf, as after the first generation and then the second generation, people start specializing in things. Just like you have some specializing in fiqh, some specializing in Quran, some in hadith, some in Arabic language. You start having specializations. And in Nizamiya, you literally have a major institution that has scholars who are masters in their fields. Imam Al-Ghazali, of course, was unique because he mastered all of the fields. So he's unique. But people specialize. So there were people who specialized in ihsan, in the spiritual part of Islam. So if you have a bad feeling in you, your heart is troubling you. It is reported that one of the companions came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, he asked him about bir, righteousness. What should I do to be righteous? How can I make the right decision? And he said, istafti qalbak. He said, ask your heart. That was his answer. What is your heart? How are you going to ask your heart? Is your hard drive a computer you go and ask answer? Is it Siri on your cell phone? Like, what is your heart, right? Think about this. That's your conscience. That's the heart makes your emotional decisions. It's the seat of your emotional knowledge. And it even impacts your brain. That's your heart, right? And it's so important that the Prophet ﷺ, when he would line up the followers for salat, he said, shoulder to shoulder, so your hearts will not be divided. Why did he say that? So that spiritual part of a Muslim is a very important part of us. Because our flesh is only our flesh. But your spirit and your conscience, what's in you, that is the real you. Okay? So people started specializing, taking the traditions of the Prophet ﷺ that deal with the heart and deal with spirituality. They start specializing. And so he studied Abu Talib al-Makki, Harith al-Muhasibi, Junaid al-Baghdadi, Abu Bakr Shibli, Abu Yazid al-Bistami. He started studying people like this. Now, amongst these people, there were some that believed in a type of spirituality. They were influenced by Hindus and Buddhists. So they believed in wahdatul wujud, that everything is one. And the Hindu Maharashtra gurus, if you read their writings, you'll see they reach a certain level of spirituality in their meditations, where they believe that they are actually becoming one with the Creator. And the Buddhists also want to have this when they reach the highest level, nirvana, right? So this type of thinking came into Islam. The Prophet ﷺ, he is, during the day, he's a leader, he's a father, he's in business, but at night he's making tahajjud. So he's a spiritual person connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but he's also in the world. And when he came to one of his companions, and then the person said, I spend all my time in the masjid. I read Quran, I do dhikr, I just make salat. So then the Prophet ﷺ asked him, are you married? And the man said, yes. He said, okay, who takes care of your family? And the man said, my brother. Okay, so you got two people, one all the time in the mosque, the other time working and taking care of two families. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, your brother is a better Muslim than you. Your brother's better. Think about that. Okay? So that type of thinking, this was the problem that the people of Tasawwuf were having. You have some people who, like Junaid and some people, they were scholars and they believed you take the spirituality out of your Quran, Sunnah, Hadith, Prophet's life. Other ones, they said, we're going to go straight to Allah. So we're going to do spiritual exercises, fasting, torturing our bodies. In some parts, they even start like whirling, whirling dervishes. They start whirling around. Try whirling around. Do it 20 times. And feel your head, right? You're going to be dizzy, right? If you do it 100 times, if you can make it, some people say you start raising up where you're looking down on yourself. You go into this state, right? And it's a high state. Timothy Leary in the 60s, when the hippies wanted to get spirituality, but they didn't want to go to India and other places to suffer, he said, I'll put it in a pill. So he made lysergic acid, they call acid. So you take the pill and you go on a trip. So you don't have to do all that whirling and all this other stuff. Just take the pill. So they would go on a trip and everything starts hallucinating and all these things. So that's that high level, right? So the problem they were having, is, how to balance this thing out. So Imam Al-Ghazali, he started going into all of their writings and studying all their teachers. Okay? And he realizes that there's something that the Sufis are saying, even the scholarly ones. They're saying that there's a certain type of knowledge of ihsan that you can't get in a book. You have to experience it. It's experiential knowledge. So you have to experience this thing. If you want to know about poverty, you have to understand what poverty is. That's part of the blessing of Ramadan, because when we fast, we understand what it's like to be hungry. Otherwise, most of us, especially here in this part of the world, you're never hungry, unless there's something wrong with you, right? There's always Tim Hortons around, or some way that you can eat or drink, right? You're never going to go hungry. But Ramadan, we're hungry, right? So we now experience hunger pains, and dizziness like people who don't have the food. Okay? So Imam Al-Ghazali, he realized there's something missing. And at that point in his life, he had become so high. And he went into this knowledge that even Nizam al-Mulk would actually call him in to settle disputes between himself and the Abbasid Khalifa. That's how high he was. So he's like, becomes like a main advisor to the prime minister. Okay, so he reached that high level, there in terms of his influence and the society. And so, but he reached the point, he had exhausted the theological knowledge. He had exhausted the philosophies, and he refuted it. He had exhausted the Batiniya knowledge, and he refuted them. He went through all the Sufis' writings and everything that they had. There was like nothing left for him to read, right? And so he's saying, but there's something wrong. He started doubting himself. And that is a human being. And by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, something happened to him. And this happens to some people. Today they would call it a nervous breakdown. Because some people just get overworked so much, their brain is so used, they just break down. So he had taken in so much knowledge, he was on such a high level that it all just came down on him, and he felt, something's wrong. And suddenly he went into I don't know how they'd explain it today, but his mouth and brain shut down. So he went to a lecture with hundreds of people there at the lecture, and he sat there and he couldn't talk. He couldn't say a word. This is Imam Al-Ghazali, right? The level of knowledge he had. He could not say a word. He just looked at them. And after a while, they just said, okay, students, this class is off now. And they took him aside. They said, okay, what's happening, man? What's wrong? And he said, I can't do this anymore. Right? So at that point in his life, around approximately 37 years old or so, he left Baghdad. He set his family up properly. He left his teachings. He put people in positions to take over his positions as the teachers and the leaders. And he went into traveling in the land into a type of seclusion, a type of khalwa. He wanted experiential knowledge. So he traveled through what is now known as Asham. So that would be Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. No, first what he did was he made Hajj. And that was part of the excuse. He said that I'm going to make Hajj. After Hajj, he then went up to Jerusalem. Went to Medina, and then he went to Jerusalem. And then he stayed there for a period of time. In some reports, he lived by the minaret. And he just stayed by himself, in seclusion. Right? And he's thinking, making dhikr, pondering, watching people. And then he starts moving around to different sites. So he's just experiencing people. He's trying to understand himself too, right? He's trying to understand himself. So he did this for a period of time. There's different opinions about how long. Was it 5 years? Was it 10 years? He spent a period of time on the road. Okay, in this, this part of his life. And he started doing writings as well. So he started putting this, especially the knowledge of the heart. Because he's now analyzing himself, analyzing people in a different way. He's not involved in politics. He's no longer with the king, the prime minister. He's no longer the star, of the universities. Everywhere he sits down, hundreds of people want to listen to him talk. Too much fame and all this other stuff. He doesn't want to be involved in riyah, showing off, right? So he said, no, I want to understand my heart. I want to understand the internal Muslim. So that's the kind of person he was. Instead of just talking about it, he did it. So he literally plunged into this lifestyle for a period of time. Following that, he was getting news of what was happening. The universities, Muslims were then still suffering. The universities was in confusion. They needed guidance. And he spent a long time now pondering on himself, doing writing. And he said, he knows there needs to be a revival of Islam. There's got to be a revival. I've mastered all the science. I'm my inner self. Now there needs to be a revival. So he returned to Tus, where he was born. He went into seclusion. And following this, the leader of the Seljuks, who was Fakhrul Mulk, he called him back to teach in the Nizamiyah. So he went back and he was teaching. And it was during this time that he completed, amongst the different things that he completed, 2 of his major works. Al-Munqidh min ad-Dalala. This is deliverance from error. And that's where he shows his life. How he had reached a certain level, his spirituality was lost, and then how he found the spirituality, and now he comes to a balance, right? So it's like his autobiography. Okay? And then he wrote Ihya Ulum ad-Din. And this is the revivification, putting life back into the Islamic sciences. Here's your tajdeed, clear. And so he went through all the different areas of Islamic sciences, focusing on the personalities, the heart, especially the qualities. And he brought this back out in order to revive Islam and bring people into a balanced way, to understand where they are coming from. And he continued in this path of balance until 1111, at 53 years old, only 53, right? Then he passed away, rahimahullah. And there's different reports. I mean, he was so spiritual that when he felt it was time to die, he contacted his people and he said, I'm ready. And he got his kafan, and then the next morning he was dead, right? And then, because he knew it was time. And he passed away, 53 too. So, in our day and age, there's a lot of time left, right? That's how much he accomplished in this part of his life. He accomplished so much, right? That he is one of the most influential scholars, you can say. He influenced a lot of people. There are people who criticize him, who look at his works and they say, well, he brought a lot of things in his Ihya, and there were some weaknesses in some of the hadiths that he brought, right? And so there are different books. Next week I'll give you some of the writings that came out of his writings. But his main thing was to revive Islam. And that's where you'll see the power in his writings and the things that he did. So in conclusion today, I want to look at some of the major achievements that he made. So these are some of the major achievements that he did in his scholastic life to revive Islam. First is that he freed Islamic thought from Greek philosophy. Okay? He freed the Muslims from that. And Muslims were getting confused. The Mu'tazila movement and these ones, they was confusing people with logic. People can really get ridiculous with their logic. And you can start losing your faith. He answered the Greeks. He answered the Mu'tazila in an Islamic way, using Quran, Hadith, Islamic way of approaching it, and spirituality. 2, he corrected overly rigid scholars. The scholars who had become frozen, blind imitators. He corrected them, and he brought back the spirit, of Islam, and he brought them out of their taqleed. Because what they would do is that if you were against them, you're kafir. That's their solution. And you see it today. If you're not with them, my way or the highway. You see Muslims making takfir on each other, man. Because you're not in their group. Sufi, Salafi, Ikhwani, Tablighi. You see the groups, talking against each other. And sometimes really bad. They won't even go to the janazah of a person and stuff, man. It's like takfir that they're doing, right? So he brought people out of this rigidity. 3, he brought a rational interpretation of the fundamental beliefs of Islam. So what he did was he showed the beliefs of Islam and he explained it to people. So it wasn't just, you got to do this. Because this happens to many of us. That, the father says to his son, to the young boy, make salat. And the young boy turns around to his father and says, why? Now, that's a good question. But for most fathers today, why is not in his vocabulary, man. There's no why. But he should know why. The Quran says, Inna salata tanha anil fashai wa munkar, that prayer prohibits evil and corruption. So Imam Al-Ghazali would bring things like this and show you why you're praying. What's the benefit of making wudu? The tahara, right? Purity. What's the benefit of making the prayers? What's the benefit of fasting? What's the benefit of Hajj? What's the spirit behind all these things that we're doing? He provided a rational discussion, which helped the Muslims who were being tested with their religion. Next, he distinguished Islam from the un-Islam of the deviant sects. So he was able to show the Batiniya for their false claims and to show what Islam really is. Because if you say you're Muslim and you submit to the will of Allah, you should be following the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. It's clear if you follow in the Quran that the Prophet ﷺ very clearly, the Quran says, "May yuti ar-Rasula faqad ata Allah." Whoever obeys the messenger has obeyed Allah. So how can you disobey the messenger and claim you're obeying Allah? So he showed these people false. All those underground secretive groups, he exposed them. Next, he revived the spirit of Islam and ijtihad. Ijtihad is that ability to face new challenges with the Islamic knowledge and bring solutions to new situations. That's tajdeed, right? So he brought that spirit back. And he was a mujtahid. He had enough knowledge to be considered mujtahid. Okay? Next, he criticized the decaying educational systems. Right? He criticized the schools that were, just blind imitation. And you know what he brought? Because some of the schools in the Muslim world, you'd be surprised to know, back then, they started separating Islamic studies from secular studies. So if you're going to study science, astronomy, medicine, you're not going to study tafsir and fiqh. Imam Al-Ghazali brought an integrated system. He brought back integrated system where you will study Quran, Sunnah, fiqh, and medicine, astronomy, and other things. And his curriculums that he developed was used in the Muslim world for hundreds of years. This is tajdeed here. Clear. His curriculums that he brought. And that's one of the problems that we have now today. Because when we were conquered by the colonial, they separated Islamic studies from secular studies. Right? And that's what we need today, integrated curriculums. Right? And that is one of his greatest achievements, that he was able to do that. Next, he criticized the moral condition of the Muslim world. He criticized everybody. He criticized the kings and rulers. He criticized the scholars. He criticized business people. He criticized common people. He showed all the moral corruption in all these different groups and brought solutions to this. Okay, that's an amazing thing. So his Ihya Ulumuddin, it's packed with advices and knowledge and things. Next, he criticized the officials and he emboldened the masses. When he came back, he did not want to be involved with the kings anymore. And he was even quoted to have said, "In our days, most of the estates of the rulers have been unlawfully acquired. Most of their stuff is haram." And he's saying, if you want to be a real scholar, don't get caught next to the sultans. This is a thing raging right now online. If you're online, this big thing about scholars who go to the leaders, and certify them. Imam Al-Ghazali, no. If you're for real, don't get caught with your face in the face of the sultan. Okay? And he wrote letters to the ministers and the leaders of the time. He directly wrote to them, criticized them, and told them. Now, he didn't form any movements. He did not do, civil disobedience and form a movement to overthrow the government. He didn't do that. Okay? To make things clear. Because this is all raging online now, right? He didn't stop it, but his job, he openly criticized and told people, you got to do what is right, whether they like it or not. And he emboldened the masses of the people. Don't be afraid of them. Fear Allah. That's a serious thing for a scholar to do. So these are some of his major achievements that Imam Al-Ghazali made. And inshallah, next week, we want to go into some of the actual teachings. So you'll actually taste some of his teachings, and I'll bring you a few of the texts that you can actually access to see his teachings in different forms. Before we close, I will open up the floor. Are there any questions anybody has about anything? Floor is open for any questions anybody may have.
What is the current name of the Nizamiya that existed at that time?
The name of the Nizamiya?
Yeah, the one that existed in Baghdad at that time.
They basically call it the same. It's Nizamiya Institute. Madrasa Nizamiya.
Still the same.
But it's the chapter in Baghdad. And you'll see how important it is. We used to read Quran, Qaida Baghdadiyya. Everybody reads all over the world. Your first tajweed book is usually the Qaida Baghdadiyya. Right? It comes out of Baghdad, right? Hundreds of years. This was the center of Islamic knowledge. But the Nizamiya Institute, it had different wings. The major institute was in Baghdad itself, but there were wings in other major capitals, as well. Now, any other general questions anybody has? The floor is open. So inshallah, next week, we will be going on to actually look at some of the teachings of the Imam. And I'll bring you a few texts, where you can see the original Ihya, and you can also see abbreviated forms of it, where you can get some of the knowledge of Imam Al-Ghazali. So I leave you with these thoughts. Have a safe journey home. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.